Here we go. Hi.
Nick, can you hear us?
Can you hear us?
Yeah, I think I'm finally in. I'm sorry
All
about
right.
that. It was against me today.
Okay, so I don't know if you heard my introduction. I don't know what you heard or didn't hear, but I did in fact see you on doing an interview on Activism Munich. And it was just, I just thought you really did an excellent job of laying out the ways in which the military industrial complex gets around everything having to do with climate crisis, is causing it, and then planning on how to use it to then take further control. Like, it's really nefarious. And so if you would, I mean, just introduce yourself, because, you know, this is one of those things where I watch random media that other people might not watch. So
Sure. Well, thanks for the invite first, and sorry for the difficulties getting on, but I'm here. I work for the Transnational Institute and have been a kind of climate social justice activist for at least 20 plus years. And the Transnational Institute is an institute based in the Netherlands, which works with social movements internationally. And our goal is really to provide the research that will support social movements on the front lines. And so I've been particularly working on climate issues, I guess, since I lived in Bolivia for 4 years, between 2004 and 2008. It was a fascinating time because it was when the indigenous movements came to power, and brought Evo Morales at the time to the presidency. But it's also where I first became aware of, like, climate change wasn't something I knew it was coming on the horizon, but it felt like it was a bit far away. Mm-hmm. And while I was there, I was living in La Paz, and they get about 20% of their water from the glaciers. And their major glacier, which was predicted to disappear in 2020, disappeared while I was there in 2006. So I was like, heck, you know, this isn't just about warming. This is also about a water source for a major city. This is going to have huge impacts. And I ended up working with the Bolivian government on climate change, on their climate change team as media, doing some media support, and went to Copenhagen, which was there's a lot of hype around Copenhagen. It got hyped as the Copenhagen at one point. And a lot of expectation there would finally be some kind of climate deal, and it all collapsed. Lots of great talk, but nothing actually delivered. And at the same time, I was talking to people who were involved in kind of doing military and security analysis, and they said, well, the military are ready for climate change, whether we do anything or not. So I was kind of intrigued by this mixture of inaction on one side, and yet the military quite clearly making plans for climate change. So that's when I sort of pulled this book together of people who were studying both what would be the impacts of military planning for climate change, how would that impact on people, and how would it impact on things like food, water, energy security, on migration, and so on. And the big thing that came through was very clearly was that the military is not a climate denier. There's a lot of climate denialism, whether it's the kind of overt kind or whether it's the subtle kind of saying the right things but doing nothing.
What is
but the military are very clear. They know climate change is coming. Even during Trump's time, they changed some of their language. They called it, you see in the documents, they called it extreme weather. They wouldn't use the word climate change, but they continued working on climate change the whole 4 years he was in power.
Right. I mean, they're working on it from the sense of how to control the masses and fortify what the powers that be have. And they're working on it from a perspective of how to save themselves. They're not working on it from a perspective of how to best serve the mass amounts of people.
No, I mean, the Pentagon is the largest emitter of fossil fuels in the world. And it's totally tied into a fossil fuel economy. You know, the reason why does the US have 800 military bases around the world? It's fundamentally to have strategic access and strategic dominance over key resources, oil being one of the biggest one, but minerals as well, and shipping lanes. So they're totally tied into an oil economy. But I guess they have I would say three interests. One is they want to continue to secure their assets, and actually their military bases are often very vulnerable to climate change. They're often on coastal areas. I mean, most people who listen to this broadcast can probably think, and especially those on the coast, can think of a military base right down by the sea. So they're really affected by sea level rise. And they're also affected because they're, when, for example, in Iraq or Afghanistan, the insurgents fighting the US troops were often realized that all they had to do was tackle the oil convoys, and then they would seize up the whole military. So General Mattis, one of Trump's generals, was one of the ones who talked about the tether of oil. He says we're really vulnerable by being so dependent on oil, especially for the tanks, the Humvees, and so on. So that's one of their interests, is like, and they also know that in hotter temperatures, they've got to adapt to fight in those conditions. So yeah, it's about their operations, but they're also thinking, what's the world we want to fight and dominate in? And that's a world where they anticipate a lot more conflict. So they're seeing this kind of world of fighting and violence that will erupt from climate change. They call it the threat multiplier. It will make terrorism worse. It will multiply the threat of terrorism. It'll make the wars worse. The threat of China, of course, being the big one on right now under the Biden administration. So they see the climate change as kind of fueling all those things. And they're saying, how do we remain dominant? And particularly, how do we secure the richest, most powerful interests, the corporate interests? How do we make sure we control supply lines, supply chains, resources, and so on?
As far as the output, I mean, obviously they are the biggest user of fossil fuels. I mean, there's, but they are also, there was something that you had written, I just read a whole bunch of stuff and I don't know what was what, but where you were talking about how one word that is not anywhere in the Paris Climate Agreement is military. That they were able to exempt themselves from any accountability.
And that's not an accident.
For climate crisis. And and could you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that I would have never thought that or even thought to look for that. But yeah, that's quite absurd that the largest user of fossil fuels is not mentioned in the International Climate Pact.
Yeah, no, it was the elephant in the room, as the classic expression goes. They're a huge part of it, producing fossil fuels, and some of all their green talk can't hide the fact that no matter what they do, their planes, especially, and their shipping is totally dependent on oil. And so they're huge amounts of oil consumption. There's one plane, I think it's called a Strato Fortress, it's called, and it uses as much car oil in 1 hour that an average US car driver would use in 7 years. So we're talking like gas guzzling monsters.
Yeah.
And they can't, and that whatever there's nothing you could do to replace that right now, technologically wise. So yeah, and they clearly did not want any controls on their military capabilities. So they got an exemption, and that was fought for by the US government and a few others from the Paris Accord. But they are that some now that was in Copenhagen, they were exempted, and the Kyoto Protocol, they were exempted. But there is now some reporting done, but it's very haphazard, and it generally doesn't involve oil use overseas. So some countries report the missions that their military uses domestically, but very few will do it overseas. And when you've got a US which has an empire of 800 bases overseas, and a lot of its operations working internationally, it basically means that they're exempt from anyone really looking at what they're doing.
I think it's interesting how we talk about how can we reduce our carbon footprint around the world. And one of the things that is not getting nearly enough criticism of the Biden administration, and this is the problem with, the neoliberalism of our corporate media, not just in the United States, but as you know, the BBC, lots of different news organizations around the world. Not only is Biden not decreasing the military budget, he's increasing it this first year by another $20 billion while saying he's pulling us out of Afghanistan. I don't know about you, but that money's going somewhere and it's going to be spent on something. Is it an invasion war in Venezuela? I don't know, but they have 25%.
Stay tuned.
Yeah, they have 25% of the crude oil supply on the planet under their soil. And our country
We're
wants
displeased with them.
Very much so. And sanctions only hurt innocent working class people. They do not.
So
hurt
are you
rich
suggesting
people.
we'd be better off doing like a full-scale invasion of Venezuela? Is that what
How
you're
about just leave them
suggesting?
alone and reduce the military budget? But how do we
okay.
combat? Because that seems to me to be the hardest. The hardest bridge to cross for a lot of people is understanding just how detrimental it is that we have this runaway, out of control military spending in this country. And that's only what we see on paper, Nick. As I'm sure you know, there is trillions in unaccounted money that is also involved with the military that is not on the books.
Yeah, I mean, it's deeply embedded in the whole political system. And you could see that, there was one that there's, you had the withdrawal from, we don't know quite what kind of withdrawal it will be from Afghanistan, but that's really about it's a repositioning, and there is no attempt to actually scale back on the military industrial complex. And it's deeply embedded. It's deeply embedded in each, it was warned about by Eisenhower. He was a general himself. He knew back in the 60s as a president and as a former general how powerful it become then. It's only become even more powerful since. We had the end of the Cold War. There was hopes it would scale back, and yet military spending has more or less doubled, and it goes up regardless of which administration is in power, regardless of their particular tactics. And it's so deeply embedded in US politics and economics, so that the defense industry is, we have the kind of revolving doors going back and forth continuously between people who were in leading arms manufacturers, who then become secretaries of defense or assistant secretaries of defense, or just people in the defense department, and then going back out. We have the huge amount of money, and they are the biggest contributors to the congressional committees, the Senate committees. I just looked at the border industry, and many of them actually, interestingly, this is one of the things we're seeing, is many of the same military companies that provide the arms are also doing most of the border militarization that's happening on the borders. And they actually gave about $10 million in 2020 to strategic legislators. We're talking the Homeland Security Committee, we're talking the Appropriations Committee in both the Congress and the Senate. So they're very, very strategic. They make sure, and then of course we know that in every congressional district there is some kind of military base, so that there is always the shout of jobs. So they've also co-opted various of the kind of some of the trade union sectors into that as well, so that any attempts to kind of scale back is really strategically hard to do. But I think we have to kind of go back to the time of, and kind of repick some of the energy up that really got mobilized around the Iraq War. We had a kind of unprecedented global movement that was built at that time. And now is a time to put it forward, and we need to make those connections with other issues. We've got big mobilizations now around climate, but they don't often enough talk about the military. Both the way that the military is looking as climate change as the next war that they need to fight, and therefore the excuse for more spending. And we know what that means. That means that the victims of climate change now become the threats, because they will be the ones moving. So we have to get the weapons to fight the victims of climate change, because they're now threats. So it will exacerbate the climate crisis. But it's also, as you said, it's really diverting huge amounts of resources. Just imagine that 750 billion going towards a massively scaled up Green New Deal. It would transform the situation. And so we've got to make those connections, and we've got to build the movements that bridge the peace, the environmental movements, the social justice movements together.
I would definitely say that the biggest issue, and what I think is a separate, where the rubber meets the road, so to speak, when Jen ran for the U.S. Congress against Debbie Wasserman Schultz. If you know anything about her, she happens to be probably one of the foremost of the pro-war Democrats that exist. She votes yes on every military intervention. She is a huge advocate for intervention, regime change in Venezuela, among other places, including Syria. I think when you really get down to it, I think it really just comes down to the hooks that the top military contractors in the U.S. and around the world have in our elected officials. 3 of her top contributors are Raytheon, General Dynamics, and I believe it's either Lockheed Martin or there's
Honeywell.
Boeing.
Oh, Boeing.
Honeywell. Yes, Honeywell is the other one. Excuse me.
All fun things.
And so I think that probably more than anything else is really there's something to be said for the corporate versus non-corporate movement in electoral politics that's happening in this country. I don't think enough potential grassroots candidates lean in enough on these corporate representatives who are, if you want to talk about who they are completely captured by, it is the military industrial complex. And if you could talk on that, that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, they're very much tied. And I think, in terms of just the kind of corporate influence, it's partly the arms industry is kind of one of the key players that is really fueling this. And so I saw it here just with my own representative here in California. He's Garamendi, and they're very much they're bought into this, both the money stream and also the interests, and they believe. And they've also bought into some of the rhetoric, I think. It was noticeable that Biden, when he just had this virtual climate summit, the second part of his agenda was called climate security. And they're now using really the military to say that because it's a military threat, this is why we should have climate action. So they're kind of dovetailing now this idea that the military can be a kind of a progressive actor in this whole scheme, and I think that's very dangerous. And I think Democrats really need to call, progressive and left Democrats need to call this out, because I see too many just saying, okay, well, the military is it's good to have them on board. If we can advance things on climate change, then let's just embrace them. But without looking at how the military has always stood behind corporate interests. I think it's Thomas Friedman. It was one who has that famous quote that behind every McDonald's there is a I think it was, I forget which military company, there's a Raytheon or something like that. Yeah. But basically his argument was that if you want to have corporate freedom and corporate profits, then it has to be backed up with the fist, with the might, so that those two things run together, that corporate expansion and corporate profits depends on the military might, depends on the fist that behind it that compose the threats. And that's very much why we've seen the two things run together. Globally, we've had a huge expansion of corporate trade regimes which don't benefit people, either in the US or outside. They're about driving prices and profits, and they're about driving prices down, labor costs down, increasing profits. And at the same time, we've had a huge expansion of the military. Those two things very much run together. And it's very obvious that throughout this whole, that's really since the 90s, since the end of the Cold War, that kind of those two agendas have run both internationally and domestically. So we've had a huge rise in corporate profits here, huge rise in corporate power domestically, so much so that it's kind of created a kind of norm where you cannot challenge it, that anything that challenges the interests of profits is kind of anti-democratic. Anyone who opposes that is seen as a threat. And at the same time, you've had this huge military-industrial complex emerge at the same time. So they're very much embedded together, and we have to kind of tackle them in that kind of integrated systemic way.
I think that's a great segue into a very important question. I think of all the movements that were sustained, especially during the Trump administration, that was on the side of actually, doing something good, especially in terms of in the environmental movement, was the Sunrise Movement. But I think the biggest problem with the Sunrise Movement, and I think it's the biggest problem that a lot of movements end up having, is that they end up getting co-opted by one of the two major parties. And once that ends up happening, you're basically finished. It's just a question of when, because both major parties are completely captured by corporate special interests at the height of them. It doesn't mean there aren't representatives who aren't fighting on behalf of the people, but right now it's a very small percentage of those that are actually doing that. So as long as we have sort of this corporate duopoly that exists, I think, and Jen has really echoed these sentiments, that the future of the change we're looking for is in a nonpartisan labor movement. How do you feel about that idea?
Well, I think I mean it's a huge systemic challenge that movements face, and I think we have to work at it at two levels. I think I don't think there's one simple. If you get out and you're just not involved in the political system and just build movements, then you can't kind of move the agenda forward politically in terms of policy. If you're in and you, like you said, there's the whole dangers of co-option. And I think movements have struggled with this right at the beginning. I mean, if you look at the kind of whole Indignados movement in Spain, where they had a huge mobilization on the streets, they built very strong movements. But at a certain point, they realized that they weren't changing everything. So then they started to form a party. A similar thing happened in Bolivia, where I was living, where you had huge, powerful indigenous movements. But it was only when they set up what they called an instrument for the sovereignty of the peoples, which was these kind of ideas of movement parties, that they started to actually have an impact on and eventually took power. But then the co-option thing started to happen. So there's going to be a constant dynamic of tension, I think, between movements and parties. And I think as activists, we have to kind of navigate that tension. We need to remain independent. We should never put our trust entirely in political systems, but we need to also fight battles within them at times. I think it's a complex terrain, but I don't think there's any way of just avoiding it. And I think we need to learn the lessons, from Bolivia as an example I saw, where it really started to have some transformational change, but at a certain point, the government, the political party started to take over movements and started to become more corrupt, and the movements were no longer holding the party to account. So you have to have these, I think you need as movements also to retain independence from the political system whilst also engaging with it. Otherwise you'll see the kind of the corruption and also just the co-option that you talk about going on.
Yeah, I think the problem here is that in this country, we have two corporate parties, which is basically one party. And they all roads lead to the same ownership of those parties. And it's sort of like this, it's like political theater controlled opposition situation. And that's the problem, is that the movements that we're seeing that are happening outside the system are having a very difficult time transitioning and penetrating into that political arena. I mean, you see a few people get in here and there. I mean, we're hopeful that Nina Turner will get in, and you'll get people on the inside that actually are true to the stuff that they were on the outside. And it's just very difficult to see that actually happening.
Yeah, I don't disagree. It's, but it's, I mean, we're seeing also changes that have happened. I've only been in the US. I've lived in the US 12 years. And even in those 12 years, there have been some kind of, you both see the strength of the challenge that we face. And of course, Biden coming to the presidency was part of that. But you also see kind of the rise of movements, whether it's Sunrise or DSA or whatever, that are gaining strength in a way that you couldn't quite have imagined 12 years ago. So we're also...
Yeah. And I'm thankful to Trump for that, actually. I said in the very beginning when it came down and I thought he was going to win, I'm like, well, he's going to facilitate the revolution. And a lot of the people that are caring about things now would have gone back to brunch if Hillary had won, and wouldn't. I mean, that's the silver lining, is it's sort of like, I think more people have been...
It woke people up, didn't it? Because I mean, the interesting thing about Trump is I once thought of writing a piece about the truth, or the truths that Trump told rather than the lies, because
it would be a smaller book.
Well, the interesting thing was occasionally he would say things like there was a point where he talked about the defense budgets all being just responses to Raytheon. He actually said that.
He said out loud that we were in Syria for the oil. I was so pleased.
Exactly. So he says he occasionally would say truths that would unmask, and even if he didn't say them, you saw. I mean, just the fact of the border. We know that the border militarization started a long time ago, and it was. It was Trump, Obama was one of the biggest expanders of it. But it was only when Trump brought a kind of extra level of cruelty, visceral cruelty and open cruelty to it, rather than the hidden cruelty, that actually people got mobilized. I saw in my town groups that never were active, from churches to just lots of citizens just outraged, and they have stayed engaged, so there was a kind of waking up, which is something we've also got to build on.
For somebody who was born and raised in a country that has universal health care, how much of a difference do you think that would make in the United States when it comes to these, let's say, climate movements, if they weren't so dependent on, worker-based healthcare, or the fact that our healthcare system is for profit and we are the only developed nation on earth that has that? Do you see that as being one of the major impediments to having a sustainable movement here in the U.S.?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I couldn't believe it here. Even just my first few days, just going to going to a clinic and then having to kind of show my credit card, and then show my insurance and then fight bills, and but also just the level of stress and anxiety it creates.
Yeah.
You're as between jobs at one point, and it just creates a level of stress and anxiety that's huge, and we know it creates huge levels of debt, indebtedness, and so on. And it's not just the health system; it's the whole lack of a welfare state. Just paid, whether it's paid holidays or paid childcare and so on. But of course, Britain has also gone through a phase where the national health system has been gradually privatized. You can still get free care, but the system is now being more and more driven towards supporting private profiteers within it. And the universal services are kind of becoming cut back, so like
that's how it happened.
Become more and private. It's more and more, it's gradually happening. So it's not a one fight. And we know that, but it does make a big difference. And I can just tell you, having experienced both those systems, that this system is really, really, really messed up.
Yeah, I mean, I think people underestimate its implications in everything else. So when you look at a country that is going to be dealing with a pandemic, and other sorts of infrastructure issues, whether they're physical infrastructure, like whatever kind of thing, sick people with poor constitution are going to not fare as well in whatever the impending situation is. And the other problem is, because people are just struggling to live, you're not getting people that are thinking about the things like their infrastructure and noticing that, oh yes, sewage is now coming up through our infrastructure. But it's just one more thing on their plate. People are so stressed about, medical bankruptcy is cause of half of the bankruptcies in this country. So it's such a massive issue. And yet, ironically, I think it makes people more susceptible to all the problems, all the health issues and repercussions of stuff that we're having.
Yeah, and of course that anxiety fuels people who say that it's someone else's fault, and the right have been very successful at kind of targeting that in a very racially divisive way, of blaming on immigrants or blaming it on lack of security and saying we need much more policing and fun. So it's that anxiety also kind of fuels an authoritarian politics as well, which is
very intersectional. I know that you had said that at one point too. It's all very intersectional, and that's why it's hard for people to, I think, wrap their heads around.
We're seeing that in Florida right now. There is no question that if Trump decides not to run again, what I call his Frankenstein monster, because he did create Ron DeSantis, he really did. He, with the snap of a finger, changed the entire gubernatorial race back in 2018.
He's sort of like the Republican Trumpy version of like Mayo Pete. He's a manufactured sort of candidate.
Yeah. Well, no, he
he
was elected in his own right, but Adam Putnam
Buttigieg was the mayor.
Well, don't compare a congressperson to a mayor
All right,
of a
I'm
small
just
town.
saying.
But the fact that he, completely, when I say he elected DeSantis governor of Florida, he elected him governor.
He appointed
of Florida.
him. No, he sort of anointed him, actually.
Yeah. And the fact is, a lot of the policies that DeSantis has been focusing on is very similar to akin to what an authoritarian would basically do, which is, there are certain constructs of freedom, if you will,
anti-protest legislation,
but then he does things like that, and then he sneaks in these ridiculous, he did this ridiculous sales tax, and all of that is being implemented for the benefit of big business. That is a big business tax cut that he had to figure out a way to pay for it. So he stuck in a little nice caveat. I thought that Republicans were about lowering taxes, not raising taxes, but hey, that's all of the story. And so I think we can see these things happening before they actually happen. I really don't know if our culture is able to be proactive versus reactive. It seems to me that the biggest problem we have in the United States today is that we're a very reactive society. Like, people want to act like they couldn't see Trump coming, but you should have been able to see him coming for decades.
Yeah.
Like that, it was just inevitable that something like that was going to happen. They really do everything in their power to try to stave off what I'm thinking could potentially be a citizens' uprising. But as it relates back to the military, I'm curious if you think we may be on the cusp of some type of a mass extinction. Now, what that would look like, I don't know. But I do think that with Bill Gates coming out the other day and saying, and I quote, "We are not giving the vaccine formula to India," when they are going to suffer the most of the COVID pandemic. Who knows how many untold deaths they're going to suffer through dealing with this problem right now. But I'm wondering if you think that there is the possibility, if you will, of some form of a mass extinction and what that might look like.
Well, we know we're already suffering a mass extinction in terms of ecologically. I mean, that's already happening. And I think, and one of the things we looked at in my book was really that we're moving to a world of the secure and the dispossessed. And that kind of, the dispossessed comes out, I think, there are two parts to that. One is that people, if they're dispossessed of their land or even a safe place to live because of climate change, or because of the violence that's coming out in terms of the kind of corporate oligarchs in Central America, where they're kind of forced to flee, which is often linked to things like corporate mining. There's a whole bunch of factors that are making people dispossessed right now. And you're right, the healthcare is another part of this dispossession. I see that kind of shaping up in two ways. One is around making people, as I think it's Olufemi Taiwo, who's a Georgetown professor, talks about people being either hyper exploitable. We want people to be exploitable, and creating vulnerability, it means that you can exploit them, and that's very much part of the whole migration movement. We want people to, we actually, corporations are quite happy to have undocumented workers in situations of vulnerability and illegality because they can exploit them, pay them crap wages, and also just make sure they can't form unions and all those things. Or hyper disposable, as in their lives won't matter. Some of them might be killed, but more often they will die. And we see that in places like, I see it in the European Union, where basically they've created the Mediterranean as a graveyard. And people are dying just trying to leave desperate situations. And so in that sense, whether that adds up to a mass extinction, it's certainly accelerating a kind of fortress world where some people are behind fairly secure barriers, protected, and others are outside and either very vulnerable or at risk of death. And that's certainly the case. I think in terms of the Gates decision, I think what I see there is part of this corporate I'd say kind of mythology. I mean, even corporations or Bill Gates need justifications and have an idea of why they do what they do. And I'm sure he thinks he's doing the right thing. But it very much fits in that corporate mythology that we keep the whole structure in place, but we are philanthropic. We show our generosity, but we don't do anything that will change the rules. So he put in a lot of his money into sending money to pay for vaccines for so on. But the moment you say, actually, the system needs to change, we need to change the intellectual property rights system, which is, of course, what Microsoft built its whole empire on, that's a line too far. And we see that going across in lots of things. So corporations are very much now, they talk about woke capitalism, but corporations want to justify themselves, and they're selling themselves as social citizens. You see them more and more in global corporate governance. COVAX, which is the way that the vaccines are distributed worldwide, is no longer run by the World Health Organization. You'd have thought a global health thing would be responded by an intergovernmental forum. No, it's a multi-stakeholder forum where Bill Gates has a seat. Now, who elected Bill Gates? No one. He's just there because he's a donor. You look at the other people on that panel, quite a few are hedge fund managers. What on earth do they have to do with health? Is there a health union worker? Not one. Of course not. No. There are donor governments. And what they do is they create this mythology that they will roll out vaccines. There will be a certain amount, but it will be a fraction of what would happen if we had a public human rights response to the crisis. And that's what I see is going on, really, is this kind of, and we see it not just in COVID, in health. We've just been doing a bit of a survey at Transnational Institute of the emergence of multi-stakeholderism. It's the language, multi-stakeholder governance. Most people turn off. They don't know what that means. But basically it means...
I can kind of figure out what it means, but
it basically means that...
we're an oligarchy.
Basically, it's self-selected, and it's around voluntary measures, and it's philanthropic. So corporations, they set up a multi-stakeholder thing to look at child or slavery in mining. So they'll set up a forum where they'll have a mining company, they'll have one civil society representative to say that they represent whole civil society. They will have some corporate donors, and then they will come up with a solution. And that's increasingly how international governance has been done, whether it's on the internet, whether it's on health, whether it's on education. It's no longer going through international institutions like the World Health Organization or the Food and Agriculture Organization. Most of these global decisions are now being done by these bodies, which are self-selected and always come up with voluntary solutions where they look like they're doing something, and they may be doing something, but they are actually undermining an international public response, a kind of a public, one which is accountable. We can't get rid of COVAX, that no one appointed them, so they run, and yet they're the ones who've decided that 80% of the world's population, even in their own plans, 80% of the world population, they will not get any vaccines by the end of this year. They just say that. And it's unlikely they'll even get to 20%, because basically we're seeing that private corporations, it's not in their interest to roll out to poor countries that can't pay.
Right. This is a problem with a profit motive in dealing with a pandemic. Well, in dealing with healthcare, period. But I actually feel like this, and because of COVID, it's almost opened a window into how sick and demented our system is in this country to other countries. I know that there have been a lot more people aware just based on what's going on with the vaccine. But there was something, it was the Harry and Meghan interview, and the people in the UK were floored with the amount of pharmaceutical ads that went on during that interview. And just in general, there is this, I think, new awareness amongst other places as how demented this is here.
No, I think there was that moment in COVID where I think there was a lot of realization that it had the potential. We had something that was global. It didn't matter what class you were, you actually could be affected. In fact, it started as a rich people's disease because it was the ones flying who kind of started to transmit it. And there was a sense that, and then there were governments taking actions like even forcing corporations to produce certain materials. You know, we had a kind of the use of the Defense Act here. There was a moment there that there was a window opened of a different way of responding to a crisis, and a realization that this was a global crisis, that we needed public health responses to it. But what we've seen is, of course, with the corporations and so much entrenched in power, they have guided the response, and they've closed that window down. I wouldn't say it's gone, because I think resistance and anger is now something we have to mobilize. I think it's absolutely disgusting that how the rich countries have just kind of grabbed all the vaccines and then have constructed a response that deprives the rest of the world of a really effective response. You know, this is a global crisis. If we were all in this together, we would have had a very different response to this. I think even back in the 1940s, you know, in the Second World Wars, there would have been a kind of different kind of spirit of we're all in this together, and it's been closed. But we've really got to stand up and say that this is unacceptable. And in the end, it's self-defeating. It's a stupid philosophy, because if we allow the virus just to go rampant, and this goes back to your point about mass extinction, it's going to actually allow new variants to appear, and the virus will come back.
Happening.
It's
already happening.
So it's really it's not just deeply immoral, it's also ultimately totally self-defeating. So, and that's why I think there is a real moment now and I think there are big campaigns right now. It's really important to express our anger to both the pharmaceutical companies, to Bill Gates, who's refusing any shifts, and to Biden, you know, to say that the US administration, it's no, you know, and again, he responds with the typical corporate mythology thing of like, we'll send so many vaccines as a nice, generous gesture. No, we need to.
And I think that their response would be just to put a woman in charge, or a woman of color. They'll just put a woman of color in charge of the response.
We need to say the system is at fault, and we need to change that system. Otherwise, we're going to continue to allow this immorality to continue.
Well, I look at it two ways. I think on the one hand, I think that there is going to be a straw that breaks the camel's back. I'm not sure what it's going to be, but I don't think we're far from it. I don't think people really understand how devastated this country is right now, especially from an economic standpoint. I don't think people really understand just how in debt tens of millions of people are, and what an abject failure Biden is going to ultimately be as president. I know people don't want to hear it, but it's going to happen, because there is no fundamental changes happening. And unless you are willing to fundamentally change the way things are done in this country, the only thing you're doing is putting a Band-Aid on a gaping wound, and that is not going to solve the problem. And then the other thing that I do think is the silver lining, if you will, if there is one, I think a lot of people are starting to recognize how the game is played and how they are being played. You know, I think it was Mark Twain who had the great line about, you know, you can fool a person. It's much easier to fool a person than to convince them they're being fooled. I think that at some point there's going to be enough people who will have their sort of come to Jesus moment and say, yeah, I've been fooled. I've been taken, and I don't want to be taken anymore. I want to do the right thing, and I want to stand up. You know, this is one of the things, as you know, Jen likes to talk about. There is no point in not trying to build bridges with people that you have disagreements with on what are known as wedge issues. I always say progressives and libertarians have a lot more in common than they don't. And what they need to be doing is finding ways to come together rather than find ways to be separated.
Well, we make everything partisan here, but the Democrats are proving over and over again that they are by no means any more favorable to any of the issues that we're talking about. So I think more people are waking up to that. What if it's a really big Band-Aid?
Yeah, no, I mean, I would agree. I think the only warning I would put is that we're used to, especially on the left, I think we kind of predict the big crisis all the time. And sometimes it's just an unfolding, more gradual crisis that's less visible. So we don't necessarily have those. We expect the cataclysm, and actually the cataclysm is either hidden or gradual, and we're going to need to find a kind of the right places to fight. I can't predict whether we know that there are real fragilities within the US economy. I don't know yet whether that will lead to a crisis in the next couple of years. But it's obviously a daily crisis for so many people every single day. It's only at moments that hits the whole and rocks the whole system.
It affects the most vulnerable people the most. And that's where we see like the biggest intersection, bringing it back to climate justice with, yes, it will eventually happen to everybody, but it's sort of like we're fighting a clock as to when it's going to happen to the most vulnerable people. And can we fix it in time before it happens to everybody? And I think that a lot of people, it's starting to reach them enough that they're seeing it. I mean, I hope so. It shouldn't require that, but unfortunately it does.
Nick, you've been in California for how long?
12 years.
Okay, so you literally were at the very beginning of what became the housing crisis here in the United States. And of course, California got hit with it as hard as any place. I do think if we find ourselves in that type of a situation again, and it's very likely that we will, that's when you're going to see a revolution in the United States. I don't think there's any way that they're going to be able to kick another 5, 10, 15 million people out of their homes without there being, like the movie says, there will be blood, and there will be, because at some point you're going to recognize why this is happening. You can make the argument. I think Newsom has been a mixed bag, but him being caught at one of the most exclusive restaurants in the United States with a cadre. It wasn't a couple of people. It was a swath of people without masks on.
An entourage. Why would you go somewhere nice without an entourage?
And this is a restaurant, mind you, in Napa
Valley.
That's why.
You're not going to go there with just
one
person.
That's like $600 a person. I mean, the level of decadence.
It's like a fundraiser in a wine cave.
Exactly. And the decadence that these people live at, to me, whether they prove, I think this has rocked his political aspirations, because we all know or at least wants to run for president. It's really just a question of now if this is actually going to hurt him enough where he's going to have no momentum, at least in his own state. But it takes one of those viral moments for people to say, F that mother effer. I ain't putting up with this anymore. He clearly is not practicing what he preaches. And now, of course, and we all know how things go in California. Now if people think that Caitlyn Jenner is the end of it, it's just the beginning. It's going to get a lot uglier than that. But just the idea, and I still think one of the things that he has done as governor that doesn't get enough scrutiny is the fact that he had an opportunity to really do something extraordinary when Kamala Harris became the vice president. And he could have absolutely chosen a very worthy successor to take over that U.S. Senate seat, in particular, Barbara Lee or Ro Khanna. And instead, he picks one of the biggest partisan party hacks in Alex Padilla to become the next U.S. senator, who has no electoral experience whatsoever. And making a move like that, to me, just speaks to the complete disconnect that these elected officials have, and the fact that they just think that the people are just going to continue to take it. I don't know how much longer that's going to happen. How do you feel about that?
I mean, I think he's a classic career politician, and he will just play the game. I don't know California well enough, I don't think, to kind of know what will happen with this whole recall thing. I think there's a lot of it's a lot of disgruntlement, people are not going to want the alternatives either that are on offer. So Correct. Quite how that shapes out, who knows? Because do you want a guy who's just a careerist, who's after himself, who's a Democrat, or do you want a kind of Republican nutcase? How do you choose?
We've been making this choice for years here.
He plays, and he doesn't take a stand on anything. I mean, the classic is on environmental issues. We've got a climate crisis. California likes to paint itself as green, but he does these kind of virtual signaling. He's now said, we're going to abolish fracking in 2023 or 2024. We're going to end oil in 2045, whatever that means. I mean, he's not going to be in power. So that
doesn't mean anything.
It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't change any of the policies. So he creates these things that's about trying to get it's virtual signaling.
So he's a typical Democrat.
I'm an environmentalist, look at me, but he won't take on any entrenched power systems.
No.
And that's classic. But we also know that against him and someone else. I mean, it was the same thing with Biden and Trump. I do subscribe to the argument that you vote for the most progressive option, but you vote for the terrain you want to fight in as well. And the fact is that at least with Biden, we can be more offensive. And
yeah,
we can
that's
take the
very
offense,
low bar.
as opposed to the defensive, trying to just fight off the latest.
The only thing I can really say as a positive for Biden is that there is a small possibility that Bernie has his ear. And if that's the case, then I
don't know how you can be that optimistic about it. I think the only thing that's decent about Biden is that he's not Trump, if that's even any consolation. And really hoping that he'll even make it through halfway through his term.
Yeah. And the one thing, Nick, that is also very interesting, and I think a lot more people need to pay attention to this. For all the negative things that people say about Republicans or conservatives in this country, the majority of the renewable clean energy you will find in the United States are in red counties, are in red states. You can say a lot of negative things about Texas with their oil, but they have a big part of their state that focuses on renewables. And in California, the massive swaths of wind turbines that you will find, especially off of Interstate 10, going through, not through LA County, but through Riverside and San Bernardino counties, those are red counties. And there are endless strips of renewable energy. I do think that there could be a environmental conservative movement in this country. But again, because we are so hyper partisan divided right now, I'm not exactly sure how we're going to get there, because while the Democratic Party has been completely co-opted by, neoliberal corporatism and this welcoming influx of the moderate / right-leaning Republicans, now you're left with a Republican Party that, because they're captured by corporate special interests, they're just a party of complete insanity in many ways. That doesn't mean that that's where all of the voters are.
No, but their platform tends to reject science.
Correct.
They tend to reject science and reason.
But what's interesting is that when it comes to things like wind turbines, hydropower, solar power, they'll embrace it because it's the economically conservative thing to do. And to me, that's kind of how you have to sell things in the United States. Like, to me, the easiest way to sell universal health care is to talk about eliminating the for-profit middlemen in between you and your doctor. They have no reason to exist. They provide no benefit whatsoever. And we're at a point now where it doesn't make economic sense to stay with fossil fuels versus going to renewable energy. Yeah. And I'm thinking that could be a tremendous bridge going forward. And I do think that that's one of the areas where we can wrap on this conversation, the importance of the economic message and how that would be beneficial to evolving where we need to go.
With climate, yeah.
Yeah, I think you've got to be smart with who you're communicating with, and not fall into the partisan divide where it's not going to help actually something that radical that could be embraced by people of different persuasions. My only warning would be that I think one of the dangers of, especially bipartisan approaches, and particularly when it gets to the messiness of Congress, but is that there is, as soon as the Democrats, actually the neoliberal Democrats on climate are most in favor of bipartisan approaches, because they lead to market solutions.
Right.
So one of the big things, like the whole thing of cap and trade, which is really just a kind of a pollution bonanza for the things, was very much pushed as a bipartisan measure. Carbon taxes, again, it often ends up just enriching the same people that you actually need to transition out of the economy altogether. And it stops, and it's also just leads to kind of incremental change that makes no real difference. It just keeps the kind of corporate siphon going, and will often end up increasing pollution in the communities most affected by oil and gas. So that's just the warning, is that, yeah, we need to kind of think about ways of kind of building coalitions, but don't ever buy this kind of that we need a bipartisan approach to climate change, because that will go in completely opposite direction to the kind of the best parts of the Green New Deal. Because the Green New Deal doesn't say we need some little market tweaking. It says we need almost like a kind of wartime mobilization, state-led, with people, with cities, looking at a real transition and about creating jobs. That won't be delivered by a little market mechanism or a carbon tax. So that's just it's not a disagreement so much as just a nuance.
No, and it's a great nuance, and it's been a great conversation. I really do think that it's important to continue these conversations.
Where can people find this book? And I noticed that it says you're co-editor and not co-author, and so I know that it's not a typical. Would you explain a little bit like what the format is and where people can find this?
Yeah, it's I mean if you just come to tni.org.
Okay.
And then /climate security, you'll find it, and some other publications looking at the military. Another one we've been doing is a lot on the kind of border militarization, and that's but tni.org is the main website to check out. And it was a collaboration. We kind of brought together people who are looking at food and water and energy, and migration, and looking at how militarization or security was starting to come into the language of everything. We hear now about food security, water security. And that's often about corporations, speculating on owning water rights and property rights or on land rights and food rights, which they can sell at a time of scarcity, and actually fuel, exacerbates the climate crisis impact on food and water. There's big bottling companies, the Nestle's and the water companies are buying up, and just individuals are buying up huge amounts of water rights across the most areas that are going to be most affected by climate change. And so, it was a collaboration of lots of people seeing how this security narrative was entering everything, and saying that what we need is not security, we need sovereignty, people's sovereignty over those resources.
Well, our vice president had a Trump moment recently where she said, we're going to have wars for water. Yeah, you're not really supposed to say that out loud, but it's obviously so true that that's what's happening. But what we like to do when we conclude all of our podcasts is ask our guests, what does generational change mean to you? And I think that there is a very clear distinction when it comes to generational change as it relates to the climate movement. So I'm curious to what your thoughts are and what generational change does mean to you.
You mean the term or the show?
No, the term.
I think it is about changing our view of I think so much of these issues around, we've talked about health, we've talked about climate, we've talked about water and oil and energy, is so much shaped in terms of of nations, and also about this generation. It doesn't involve a kind of broader view of internationalism. It doesn't look at a kind of our responsibility as humans. It doesn't look at our responsibility to the ecology, the broader ecology, and we're realizing how much when we mess up with our environment, we mess up with ourselves. And it doesn't consider the generations ahead of us. So much. I think there's a law passed recently, I think it's in Ireland actually, which actually forces laws now to be considered, to be passed, have to consider future generation impact. So that's one thing that really comes to mind is this how do we kind of bring in a kind of generational thinking, but also kind of more internationalist, less nation state, more public attitude. And I guess the generational change just also gives a sense to me of the hope that does lie with particularly youth movements right now, and a kind of waking up right now, as we've talked in this talk about kind of realization that this system is not sustainable, is not healthy, has to be changed. It's wrecking the planet, it's wrecking people's lives because it's built on insecurity. And we need to find a different system. So
I think
that's a good term.
Yep. And I think people need to start thinking on a different level. Yeah. They can't be thinking about these little, social media spats and stuff, and that's going to solve the problem.
This is why we have people like you on. I try to be as educational and as informative as we can, and bring in different things, and in a very nonpartisan manner, and things that we're all going to be dealing with. So
Yeah, it's been very informative, Nick. And
Thank
again,
you so
guys,
much.
you know, you definitely
thank you.
all the
Sorry
more
for the problems at the beginning.
No,
not
it's
at
all
all.
good. So everyone, again, we're talking with Nick Buxton, and he's with TNI, Transnational Institute, and
we've got a lot
he's scouring for the book title.
Yes,
but yeah, everybody check out this book. Nick's book is available at this website.
All the more reason to support Nick's work because he is not going through Amazon, and that is something that we absolutely encourage.
Thing, yes.
Let me see. Here we got it. Wait. And here is the book title again, The Secure and the Dispossessed, How the Military and Corporations Are Shaping a Climate-Changed World. This is a fight against our most devastating institution that we have in the United States.
We're doing it.
It was 60 years ago where he said, we must fight back, whether sought or unsought, against the military-industrial complex. President Eisenhower, one of the best presidents we ever had, fight anybody on that one. And
I'll bring Margaret Kimberly back on, and we'll talk about that one.
But obviously, Nick, it's
Thank you so much.
It's always a pleasure also to have somebody come on who has a perspective who is not from the States.
You just like his accent.
Well, I like anybody. Well, I'm
not Irish.
Yes, you're part Irish. But we know, so you must be related.
But I'm also very appreciative of anybody who can bring a perspective that comes from a country that has universal healthcare.
Well, it's a whole different thing.
Yeah. And if you've never had it or experienced it, you'll never understand what it means to actually have it.
I don't.
Because it is bloody insane that we do not have universal education and healthcare in the US.
All right. Thank you so much.
Brits need to know that too, because we're losing it. And if they came to other states, they would realize
if they lose it,
how hard it is
to get it back easy. And that's the problem. You cannot let that happen.
Well, that's why I think the more we help lead the world, the more that it's going to take off in other places like it needs to. Well, we're trying to anyway.
We're leading.
But in the meantime, Nick, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, and great. Good luck with the show. This is really important work.
Okay, really appreciate it, Nick. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thanks for watching. If you want to support our mission to transform politics into service, please like this video, subscribe, follow us on social media, and consider joining our Patreon, where you'll get early access to our interviews as well as other exclusive content. Links are in the description. Peace out.